A dangerous secret within the family, when bonds turn into a moral crossroads. That night changed everything forever. A small request from my stepmother Harper unlocked the door to a story beyond imagination, plunging us into a whirlwind of uncontrollable emotions. What happens when the fragile boundaries between family and temptation blur? Join me as we dive into this heart-pounding and deeply controversial tale. It all started with a simple request from my stepmom. A predictable rhythm that never hinted at anything unusual. But as the hours ticked by, the air seemed to shift, and an ordinary night unraveled into an unforgettable chapter of my life. What started as mundane turned into something profound, blurring the lines of familiarity and leaving an indelible mark on my soul. The morning was eerily quiet. The kind of silence that sneaks up on you and feels almost tangible. My dad's usual bustling energy was absent, leaving a void that seemed to echo through the walls of our home. I had just finished my homework, the mundane task giving way to thoughts of unwinding, when Harper's voice called out from the living room. "Can you help me with something?" she asked. Her voice was soft, but there was an edge of hesitation that caught my attention. I paused for a moment, trying to read her tone before responding. "Sure. What do you need?" I replied, heading toward where she was sitting. Harper was always composed, carrying an air of effortless calm. But today something was different. There was an almost imperceptible tension in her posture, a flicker of unease in her otherwise steady eyes. She smiled, but it wasn't her usual warm, easygoing smile. Instead, it felt charged, as if there were layers beneath it I couldn't quite decipher. "Come sit down," she said, gesturing to the cushion next to her on the couch. I hesitated briefly, sensing an undercurrent I didn't fully understand. But I complied. As I sat, the room seemed to shrink, the atmosphere becoming heavier with each passing second. Harper leaned back slightly, crossing her legs in a deliberate motion, her gaze unwavering. "You've grown up so much," she remarked. Her voice was light, almost playful, but the words carried a weight that made my chest tighten. "You're not the little boy I used to know." Her statement caught me off guard. My pulse quickened, and a subtle wave of discomfort swept over me. This wasn't like her. Harper and I had always shared a casual, easygoing rapport. But now, there was a strange intensity in her tone, a hint of something unspoken that made the air feel electric, and not in a comforting way. "I guess," I muttered awkwardly, unsure how to respond. Her eyes remained fixed on mine, unyielding and filled with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. "No, really," she pressed. "You've changed. And I think we both know it." The words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. My mind raced, searching for the right thing to say or do to dissipate the tension that was rapidly building. But nothing felt appropriate. There was something in the way she spoke that sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. "Harper, what are you trying to say?" I finally managed to ask, my voice steady but filled with unease. I needed clarity, an explanation for why this moment felt so loaded with significance. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she held my gaze for a few more seconds, her expression unreadable. Then, she sighed deeply, breaking eye contact as she rose from the couch and walked over to the window. The sunlight streaming through the glass caught the edges of her figure, casting a silhouette that seemed almost otherworldly. For a moment, she simply stood there, her back to me, as if wrestling with thoughts too complex to articulate. The silence between us grew louder, a symphony of unspoken emotions filling the space. I watched her, my curiosity and apprehension mounting in equal measure. Whatever she was about to say, I knew it would change everything. "Do you ever feel like life shifts in ways you don't see coming?" she finally said. Her voice quieter now, almost a whisper. Like one moment, everything feels predictable. And the next, you're standing at the edge of something bigger. Her words were vague yet profound, and they sent my mind spiraling in 1,000 different directions. I didn't know what she was leading up to, but I could sense that this was only the beginning. "Your dad's gone for the weekend," she said quietly. The stillness of the evening seemed to amplify the weight of her words. "It's just the two of us here." I nodded slowly, a faint unease settling in my chest. The way she spoke, the way her shoulders seemed tense yet deliberate, left me wondering. A knot tightened in my stomach, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever she was about to say would change everything. She turned to face me then, her expression a mixture of hesitation and determination. Her eyes, though soft, held a gravity that made my pulse quicken. "You know," she began, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of vulnerability. "I've been thinking. There are things I've wanted to say, things I've kept to myself for far too long." I swallowed hard, unsure of whether I was ready for this conversation, or even what this was. "Things like what?" I asked cautiously, my voice betraying a hint of nervousness. She took a step closer, the air between us suddenly thick and charged. Her gaze locked onto mine, unwavering. "Like us," she said simply, her words slicing through the quiet room. The silence that followed was deafening. "Us?" The word hung in the air, heavy and electrified. My heart pounded as I struggled to process what she could possibly mean. I tried to laugh, a nervous, hollow sound escaping my lips. "What do you mean? Us?" Harper tilted her head slightly, her lips curving into a faint, knowing smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "You've noticed it too, haven't you?" she asked, her voice low, almost a challenge. Panic and denial wrestled within me. I shook my head, my mind racing. I knew exactly what she was talking about, had known for months, maybe longer. The lingering looks, the accidental touches that lingered just a moment too long, the unspoken connection that felt both thrilling and terrifying. But I had buried it, convinced it wasn't real, that it couldn't be. I don't know what you're talking about," I stammered, my voice barely audible. It was a lie, of course, but one I clung to desperately, hoping it would be enough to make this moment disappear. She took another step toward me, and suddenly it felt as if the walls were closing in. The room seemed impossibly small, her presence overwhelming. "Yes, you do," she murmured, her fingers brushing lightly against my arm. Her touch sent a jolt through me, and I felt my resolve falter. I stood abruptly, breaking the contact, needing space to breathe, to think. "Harper, stop," I said, my voice trembling. "You're my stepmom. This is crazy. We can't, we shouldn't." She didn't flinch, didn't retreat. Instead, she looked at me with a calmness that was almost unnerving. "Why not?" she asked, the question hanging in the air like a challenge, daring me to confront the truth I'd been running from. I turned away, my hands trembling as I tried to collect my thoughts. Every part of me wanted to run, to escape the intensity of the moment. But another part, a part one wasn't ready to acknowledge, longed to stay. Because it's not right, I said finally, my voice barely holding steady. It's not fair, to you. To me. To anyone. If we cross this line, there's no going back. Her silence was deafening. But when she spoke again, her voice was softer, tinged with something I couldn't quite name. Maybe we were never meant to go back, she said. I turned to face her, my heart pounding, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. She stood there, steady and resolute, her eyes never leaving mine. In that moment, I realized that the answer she was looking for wasn't hers to give, it was mine. And I wasn't sure if I was ready to face it. But she didn't back down. Her steps were deliberate as she followed me, closing the distance between us with an air of determination. Why not? She whispered, her voice low but brimming with intensity. Her gaze locked onto mine, unyielding, searching for an answer I couldn't give. We're both adults. We don't have to follow anyone else's rules. I shook my head, trying desperately to keep my composure, to resist the invisible pull that was steadily drawing me closer to her. The air around us seemed charged, like the buildup before a storm. And every fiber of my being screamed at me to walk away. No, this isn't right, I said, forcing the words out even as I felt my resolve beginning to crack. There was a trembling in my voice, one I hoped she wouldn't notice, though deep down I knew she did. But what if it is? She countered. Her hand moved, almost in slow motion, reaching out until her fingers brushed against my cheek. The touch was electric, a spark that ignited something I didn't want to acknowledge. It sent a jolt through me, leaving me momentarily paralyzed. I stood there, trapped in the invisible web she was weaving with every glance, every whispered word. I wanted to say no, to push her hand away, to turn and leave before the situation spiraled further out of control. But I couldn't. Something, whether it was her presence, the weight of the unspoken, or my own weakness, kept me rooted in place. I hated myself for it. Each passing day seemed heavier than the last. The tension between us didn't fade, it grew, becoming an oppressive force that lingered in every room of the house. Every time I saw Harper, I felt it, a silent, suffocating pressure that hung over us, filling the spaces between words we didn't dare to say. I tried to ignore it, to focus on anything else. But it was always there, lurking, pulling us closer to an edge I wasn't ready to face. The days blurred together, a haze of unspoken feelings and loaded interactions. I kept my distance as best I could, avoiding being alone with her whenever possible. But it was futile. Somehow, she always found a way to bridge the gap, to remind me of the simmering tension that refused to go away. Whether it was the lightest brush of her hand against my arm as we passed in the hallway or the way her eyes lingered on me from across the room, there was no escaping it. Then came the night everything changed. My dad was working late, and I had resolved to stay in my room, convinced that if I avoided her long enough, this strange and dangerous undercurrent between us would dissipate. But even as I told myself that, I knew it wasn't true. The tension had become a living, breathing entity, impossible to ignore. I could hear her moving around downstairs, the faint clinking of a glass, the soft murmur of the TV in the background. Time seemed to stretch, the steady ticking of the clock on my wall growing louder with each passing second. My thoughts churned restlessly, cycling through the same questions and doubts. I considered calling a friend, fabricating some excuse to leave the house. But the idea felt hollow. Something unspoken held me back, a weight pressing down on me that I couldn't shake. Before I fully realized what I was doing, I was standing outside my room, the stillness of the house pressing in on me. It was too quiet, too heavy. And in that moment, I made a choice, not out of bravery, but out of the need to break the unbearable silence. I walked downstairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. Harper was sitting on the couch, her posture relaxed but her eyes distant as she stared at the flickering screen. A glass of wine rested in her hand, the crimson liquid catching the light. At first, she didn't seem to notice me. Or perhaps she did and chose not to acknowledge it. I hesitated at the bottom of the stairs, my heart pounding. What was I even going to say? What was I trying to accomplish by coming down here? The answers eluded me, but I couldn't turn back now. She looked up then, her eyes meeting mine, and I felt the ground shift beneath me. There was no turning back. "Can't sleep?" she asked, her tone soft, almost too casual, like she was testing the waters. Yet there was something in her voice, an edge of knowing, that made my pulse quicken. "Yeah," I mumbled, not trusting myself to say more. My throat felt dry, my thoughts tangled. Slowly, I crossed the room and sat down on the far end of the couch, putting as much space between us as I could without making it obvious. But even with the physical distance, the tension remained, an invisible thread pulling taut between us. For a while, neither of us spoke. The low hum of the TV filled the silence, but it wasn't enough to drown out the weight of the unspoken words hanging in the air. I could feel her eyes on me, studying me, and it made my skin tingle in a way I both resented and couldn't ignore. I stared at the screen, pretending to watch, but my mind was a whirlwind of confusion. Finally, she broke the silence. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the words hit me like a thunderclap. "I've been thinking about us," she said, her tone steady, deliberate. Her words hung in the air, undeniable. And I knew in that moment that everything was about to change. My heart skipped a beat, the world around me blurring for a moment. "Harper, we can't," I began. But she silenced me with a firm, almost defiant look, her expression a mixture of frustration and vulnerability. "Why not?" she asked, her voice unwavering as she turned fully toward me. Her eyes burned with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. "Why are we pretending there's nothing between us when we both know there is?" Her words struck me like a bolt of lightning. I wanted to respond, to push back and tell her she was wrong. But deep down, I knew I couldn't. There was no denying the truth that had been steadily unraveling between us, a strange, magnetic pull that neither of us could resist. I felt my defenses faltering, the walls I had so carefully constructed beginning to crumble. I tried to ignore it, I confessed, my voice barely above a whisper. I told myself it wasn't real, that it was just a passing thought, a fleeting emotion. But now, sitting here with you, I can't deny it any longer. Her expression softened, her gaze locking with mine as if she could see straight into my soul. "Then why fight it?" she pressed, leaning in slightly. Her words were a challenge, an invitation, and a declaration all at once. I hesitated, My thoughts a tangled mess of logic and longing. "We can't do this," I said weakly. Though even as the words left my lips, they felt hollow. They were nothing more than a feeble attempt to cling to a moral high ground I wasn't sure I believed in anymore. Harper moved closer, her hand resting lightly on the cushion between us. "We're not doing anything wrong," she whispered, her voice low and steady, as though she were trying to convince herself as much as me. "We're not hurting anyone." I shook my head, my mind racing to find a counterargument that would hold weight. But all I could muster was a feeble, "But it's not right." Her hand reached out, her fingers brushing against mine with a gentle insistence that sent a jolt of electricity coursing through my veins. "Who decides what's right and wrong?" she asked softly, her eyes never leaving mine. "Why do we let others dictate how we feel? What we do?" Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure she could hear it. I wanted to retreat, to pull away and put as much distance as possible between us. But my body betrayed me. I was frozen, captivated by the moment, by her presence, and by the emotions I had been suppressing for far too long. "We don't have to follow anyone else's rules," she murmured, her fingers tracing delicate patterns on the back of my hand. "We can decide for ourselves what's right." I closed my eyes, willing myself to think clearly, to break free from the fog of emotions clouding my judgment. But it was futile. The walls I had so meticulously built around my heart were shattering, and I didn't know how to stop it. Worse, I wasn't sure I wanted to. Harper leaned in, her lips brushing against my ear as she whispered, "Tell me you don't feel it too." Her words sent a shiver down my spine, a visceral reaction I couldn't control. I opened my mouth to protest, to put an end to this madness. But no sound came out. Instead, I found myself turning toward her, my breath catching as our eyes met again. Time seemed to slow, the air around us thick with unspoken tension. And then, before I could think, before I could stop myself, I leaned in and kissed her. The contact was hesitant at first, a tentative exploration of the uncharted territory we were venturing into. But it didn't take long for the kiss to deepen, the restrained passion between us spilling over in waves of heat and urgency. My hands moved instinctively to her waist, pulling her closer as her fingers tangled in my hair. The world outside faded to nothing, leaving only the two of us, caught in the intensity of the moment. I knew this was a line we shouldn't cross, a boundary we couldn't return from. But none of it mattered. In that instant, there was only us. When we finally pulled away, both of us were breathless, our faces mere inches apart. Her eyes, dark and full of something I couldn't quite define, bore into mine, and I knew everything had changed. There was no going back now. "I've wanted this for so long," she whispered, her breath warm against my skin. Her words were both a confession and a plea, one that left me reeling. I couldn't bring myself to respond. The truth was too overwhelming, too all-consuming. Instead, I nodded, the weight of our actions settling heavily over me. Yet, even as guilt and uncertainty gnawed at the edges of my consciousness, a small, undeniable part of me felt something else, relief. As though I had finally stopped running from something inevitable. After that night, the dynamic between us shifted irreversibly. Every shared glance, every accidental touch, seemed to carry the weight of what had transpired. The air crackled with an unspoken tension, A volatile energy that neither of us dared to acknowledge outright. I tried to keep my distance, to maintain some semblance of normalcy. But it was impossible. The connection between us was too strong, too undeniable. Each passing moment felt like a test of willpower, a challenge to resist the gravitational pull drawing us closer. But deep down, I knew the truth. This was only the beginning. One afternoon, while my dad was out, the silence in the house pressed down on me like a weight. It was suffocating, each tick of the clock echoing in the emptiness. I paced the living room, aimlessly flipping through TV channels in a futile attempt to distract myself. But no matter what images flickered on the screen, my thoughts always returned to her. That moment haunted me, the memory of her lips brushing against mine. A fleeting contact that had set my world ablaze. The way my heart had pounded, the way the air had seemed to thicken around us, it all played on a loop in my mind. It was maddening. I hated myself for reliving it, for craving it. Yet I couldn't break free from the spell it had cast over me. I was so consumed by my thoughts that I didn't hear her approach. The sudden sound of footsteps behind me snapped me back to reality. I turned sharply, my breath catching in my throat as I saw Harper standing in the doorway. Her expression was guarded, unreadable, as if she were weighing a decision far heavier than either of us could bear. For a moment, the air between us was thick with unspoken words. The tension was palpable, a magnetic force pulling and repelling us at the same time. "We need to talk," she said at last, her voice soft but resolute. I nodded, a knot forming in my throat. I knew this conversation was inevitable, even if I wasn't ready for it. "Yeah," I managed to say, my voice barely audible. "We do." Harper crossed the room with slow, deliberate steps and sank into the couch with a sigh. I followed hesitantly, choosing the seat opposite hers to maintain some semblance of distance. My heart was racing, each beat pounding like a drum in my ears. I couldn't bring myself to meet her gaze. She clasped her hands in her lap, her fingers twisting nervously. "I know things have been different," she began, her words tentative but laced with an undercurrent of urgency. "And the last thing I want is for you to feel uncomfortable." Uncomfortable. The word hung in the air, painfully inadequate to describe the turmoil inside me. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. "I don't know what to feel," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "This, whatever this is, it isn't normal. We're not supposed to feel this way. Right?" Her eyes dropped to her hands, her brows knitting together in a look of quiet anguish. "I know," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But ignoring it doesn't make it go away. Does it?" Her words cut through me, sharp and unrelenting. She was right. No matter how much I tried to bury the feelings, they clawed their way back to the surface. They were undeniable, as much a part of me now as my own heartbeat. Harper shifted slightly, leaning forward as if the weight of the conversation was pulling her down. "I think about that night all the time," she confessed, her voice barely audible. "I can't stop." Her vulnerability took my breath away. I wanted to tell her that I thought about it too, that it had become an obsession I couldn't escape. But the words caught in my throat, held back by fear and doubt. Instead, I nodded, the gesture small but heavy with unspoken truth. The silence between us was deafening, a chasm filled with everything we couldn't bring ourselves to say. And then, as if driven by some force beyond my control, I finally spoke. I think about it too, I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. Her eyes snapped up to meet mine. And in that moment, the room seemed to shrink around us. The look in her eyes was a mirror of my own, a swirling mix of longing, confusion, and a dangerous intensity that left no room for denial. "We can't keep doing this," I said, my voice trembling. Even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it. "I know," she whispered, her gaze steady, unyielding. "But we're already here, aren't we?" Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The room felt stifling, the walls closing in as the tension between us reached a breaking point. I wanted to run, to escape the pull of this moment. But I was frozen, trapped, not by her, but by the unrelenting gravity of my own desires. Before I could fully process what was happening, she leaned in. The space between us evaporated, her face just inches from mine. I could feel the warmth of her breath on my skin, the closeness electrifying and terrifying all at once. For a fleeting second, I thought I might resist. I thought I might summon the strength to pull away, to end this before it spiraled further out of control. But then her lips found mine, and all thought ceased. The kiss was different this time, deeper, more urgent. It wasn't hesitant or unsure. It was raw, filled with the intensity of everything we had been holding back. My hands gripped the edge of the couch as if clinging to a lifeline. But there was no grounding myself now. In that moment, nothing else existed. It wasn't about logic or morality. It wasn't even about love. It was need, pure, unrelenting need. And as much as I wanted to deny it, to tell myself that this was the last time, deep down I knew the truth. We had crossed a line, and there was no going back. A raw, burning need consumed us, an uncontrollable force that neither of us could defy. My heart pounded fiercely, each beat echoing in my ears as my thoughts blurred into an unintelligible whirlpool. Logic, reason, everything dissolved in the heat of the moment. All that remained was an overwhelming certainty: there was no turning back now. When we finally pulled apart, gasping for breath, our foreheads rested against each other, trembling from the intensity of what had just unfolded. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, the gravity of our actions pressing down on us like a suffocating weight. Yet, neither of us moved, unwilling or perhaps unable to break the fragile moment. "We have to stop," I said again, though my voice faltered, devoid of any real conviction. Harper nodded slowly, her breath brushing against my cheek, warm and faintly trembling. "I know," she whispered, her words soft but tinged with a yearning that mirrored my own. "But it's so hard, isn't it?" I didn't answer because there was nothing left to say. Words felt futile against the pull that bound us together, a web we had spun with every stolen glance and every reckless touch. No matter how much we told ourselves this was wrong, that we needed to stop, the magnetic force between us seemed unrelenting, dragging us back together over and over again. And then it happened, again. She leaned in, and I couldn't resist. The moment overtook us, swift and inevitable, like the tide rushing in to claim the shore. It was electric, consuming, yet impossibly fleeting. As my world tilted and swirled, I saw the faintest smile curl on her lips, her eyes locking with mine as if to say she didn't regret a single second. Her expression conveyed more than words ever could: she had enjoyed it. Perhaps even more than I dared to admit I had. The days that followed blurred into a haze of contradictions. Outwardly, we both tried to act normal, feigning indifference and exchanging casual remarks as though nothing had happened. But beneath the surface, the tension was undeniable. A current that hummed between us, waiting for the next spark to ignite it. Every time I saw her, whether across the room or passing in the hallway, I felt the same fiery rush. The same dangerous pull that left my defenses crumbling. It wasn't a question of if we would give in again but when. One evening, while my dad was out working late, I retreated to the kitchen, hoping the simple act of cooking dinner would quiet my restless thoughts. The silence of the house was almost deafening, amplifying every creak of the floorboards and the whisper of the wind outside. My nerves were frayed, my hands unsteady as I chopped vegetables, trying to focus on the mundane task. I didn't hear her enter, but when I turned around, she was there, leaning casually against the doorframe. Her presence as magnetic as ever. Her gaze met mine, unreadable but charged, as though she was waiting for me to make the first move. "Need any help?" she asked. Her voice deceptively light, yet her tone held a quiet intensity that made my pulse quicken. "No. I'm good," I replied, though my hands betrayed me, trembling as I placed the knife down. She moved closer, her footsteps soft but deliberate, closing the space between us until the air grew heavy with unspoken possibilities. "Are you sure?" she murmured, her words a challenge and an invitation all at once. I swallowed hard, my resolve faltering. "Harper, we can't," I began, the words shaky, as if I were trying to convince myself more than her. But she cut me off, her voice barely above a whisper. "We don't have to do anything," she said, her eyes boring into mine. "But I think we both know where this is going." Her words lingered, heavy with truth. And for a fleeting moment, I wanted to argue. I wanted to deny the inevitability of it all, to push her away and walk out of the room. But I couldn't. Deep down, I knew she was right. The pull was too strong, too ingrained in every fiber of my being. Before I could gather my thoughts, she was kissing me again, a kiss that was brief yet potent enough to unravel all the walls I had so desperately tried to build. My heart thundered in my chest, and I knew, in that instant, that this was only the beginning. The weeks that followed unfolded in a whirlwind of stolen moments and forbidden glances. It felt as though we were living double lives, one where everything appeared ordinary and mundane, and another where every second spent near each other crackled with tension. Each touch, each fleeting kiss, was both exhilarating and agonizing. And the weight of our secret grew heavier with every passing day. When my dad stayed late at work, the unspoken anticipation between us would grow unbearable. We'd find ourselves in the same room, the unspoken pull drawing us together like magnets. Every glance was a promise, every accidental brush of hands a spark that threatened to ignite a wildfire. One Saturday afternoon, the air in the house felt especially charged. My dad was at a company retreat, and the knowledge that we had hours alone together loomed over me like a storm cloud. The stillness of the day was oppressive, and I couldn't shake the sense that something irreversible was about to happen. Harper was in the kitchen when I entered, her back to me as she washed the dishes. She didn't turn when she heard my footsteps, her focus seemingly fixed on the task before her. But I knew she was aware of my presence. I stood in the doorway, frozen, watching her with a mixture of trepidation and longing. The quiet anticipation that had become so familiar hung thick in the air. And I could feel the invisible thread between us pulling taut. Finally, she turned, drying her hands on a towel before meeting my gaze. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was deafening, filled with everything we couldn't bring ourselves to say. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, her voice gentle but probing. Her eyes searched mine. And for a second, I wanted to tell her everything about the storm raging within me. The constant battle between what I knew was right and the desires I couldn't suppress. But I couldn't. All I could do was stand there. "I don't know," I finally replied, my voice barely audible, like a whisper carried off by the wind. My words felt hollow, inadequate, as though they barely scratched the surface of what I truly felt. Harper walked toward me, her steps deliberate and measured, stopping just a few feet away. There was something in her eyes, a mix of resolve and vulnerability, that made my chest tighten. "I've been thinking," she began, her tone steady yet tinged with hesitation. "Maybe we should talk about what's been happening." I tensed, my body instinctively recoiling at the thought of putting our unspoken reality into words. The idea of having this conversation was as daunting as standing at the edge of a cliff, staring into the unknown. What could we possibly say that our actions hadn't already screamed in silence? Yet, despite my reluctance, I could see it in her. She wasn't backing down. She was determined. And deep down, I knew I couldn't dodge this forever. "What's there to talk about?" I asked, my voice coming out sharper than I intended, betraying the storm of emotions swirling inside me. My heart was pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. Harper sighed, a sound heavy with frustration and weariness. She rubbed her forehead with the back of her hand, as if trying to massage away the weight of her thoughts. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice softening. "Maybe we need to figure out where this is going. We can't keep living like this, pretending it's not happening." Her words struck a chord deep within me because they echoed a truth I'd been too scared to confront. She was right. Of course, she was right. But that didn't mean I wanted to hear it. "Where do you think it's going?" I asked, the edge in my voice sharper now, cutting through the space between us like a knife. Harper flinched slightly but held her ground, her gaze unwavering. "I don't know," she repeated, her voice steady despite the slight tremor in her hands. "But I do know that we can't keep tiptoeing around it. It's not fair, to you, to me. We need to face this." I exhaled sharply, running a hand through my hair as frustration bubbled to the surface. "What do you want from me?" I snapped, the words spilling out before I could stop them. My tone wasn't out of anger at her, but at my own helplessness. "Do you want me to say this is okay? That I'm fine with it?" Because I'm not. I'm not fine with any of this. Her expression softened, and the tension in her shoulders eased as she stepped closer, the distance between us shrinking to mere inches. "I don't want you to be fine with it," she said quietly, her voice a gentle yet firm plea. "I just want you to be honest, with yourself. With me." Her words pierced through the barriers I'd carefully built around myself, hitting me like a punch to the gut. She was right again. And that was the hardest part. I had been lying to myself for so long, convincing myself that this was a passing phase, something that would dissipate if I ignored it long enough. But the truth was undeniable. I couldn't stop thinking about her. I couldn't stop wanting her. And the harder I fought against it, the stronger the pull became. I don't know how to do that, I admitted, my voice breaking under the weight of my own vulnerability. I don't know how to be honest about this. Harper reached out, her hand resting gently on my arm. Her touch sent a shiver coursing through me, igniting a longing I had tried, and failed, to suppress. I hated how much I craved it. How much I craved her. It's okay, she whispered, her eyes filled with an understanding that made my chest ache. We'll figure it out together. The sincerity in her voice broke something inside me. Before I realized what I was doing, I was pulling her closer, my lips finding hers in a kiss that felt like both surrender and salvation. This kiss was different, slow, deliberate, as if we were both trying to grasp something slipping through our fingers. It wasn't frantic or rushed, but deeply intimate, like a promise we didn't yet have the words to make. When we finally pulled apart, her forehead rested gently against mine. We stood there in the fragile silence, our breaths mingling in the small space between us. I could feel her heartbeat, fast and erratic, mirroring my own. What are we doing? I whispered, the question more for myself than for her, my voice barely audible in the stillness. I don't know, she replied softly, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her eyes. But I can't stop. Neither could I. As the days passed, we found ourselves sinking deeper into whatever this was, caught in a current we couldn't escape. The moments we spent together became more intense, more frequent, until it felt like the only time I was truly myself was when I was with her. The rest of the world faded away, leaving just us, two people caught in a storm of our own making. But I knew it couldn't last. I knew something had to give eventually. Reality was a shadow lurking at the edges of our fragile sanctuary, waiting to intrude. Yet, I wasn't ready to face it, not yet. Then, one evening, everything came crashing down. I was sitting in the living room, the TV muted and flickering in the background. Though I wasn't paying attention, Harper was upstairs, and my dad was supposed to be out late again. But time had slipped away from me as I sat there, lost in a whirlwind of thoughts, of everything we had done, of everything we couldn't undo. And that's when it all unraveled. The sound of the front door creaking open sliced through the stillness of the room, yanking me out of the tangled web of my thoughts. For a fleeting second, I froze. My breath caught in my throat as a surge of panic spread through me like wildfire. I wasn't expecting my dad home so early, not yet. My pulse quickened as I scrambled to my feet, a dozen excuses tumbling over one another in my mind. But before I could compose myself, his footsteps echoed in the hallway, each one louder than the last until he stepped into the living room. His eyes swept across the space, landing squarely on me. "Hey," he greeted, his voice casual, though there was an undercurrent to it, something subtle yet sharp, like the edge of a blade hidden beneath silk. "What are you up to?" Just watching TV," I managed to say, forcing my voice to stay even though my heart hammered against my ribs. I was desperate to sound natural, to keep the anxiety from spilling over. But inside, guilt clawed at me, relentless and unyielding, a constant hum in the back of my mind. His gaze lingered on me for a moment longer, unreadable, before he moved to the couch. He sank into it with a sigh, grabbing the remote and flipping through channels as if nothing was amiss. I tried to steady myself, to breathe through the rising panic. Maybe he didn't notice anything. Or maybe he did and was letting it slide. At least for now. Either way, The secret I was holding felt heavier with each passing second. Like a stone pressing down on my chest. The tension only thickened when Harper appeared at the top of the stairs. She descended with careful steps. Her expression painstakingly neutral. "Hey, Dad," she said. Her voice light. Her tone practiced. She was good at this, better than I was, but even she couldn't fully mask the tightness in her shoulders or the way her fingers twitched ever so slightly at her sides. Dinner that night was a slow torture. The clinking of utensils against plates seemed unnaturally loud, filling the silences where normal conversation should have been. My dad made small talk about work, the news, the weather, and we replied mechanically, trying to keep the illusion intact. But I couldn't look at Harper. Couldn't let my gaze linger on her even for a second. Because every time I did, the fear inside me threatened to bubble over. I clung to the hope that we might make it through the evening. That we could keep this charade alive for just one more night. But fate, as always, had other plans. We were clearing the table. The clatter of dishes filling the strained silence. When my dad suddenly turned to me, his eyes locking onto mine. His expression was calm, but his words were anything but. "You've been spending a lot of time with Harper lately," he said. His voice steady, almost conversational, yet laced with a quiet intensity that made my stomach drop. Time seemed to slow. I felt Harper freeze beside me, her face blanching as she gripped the edge of the counter. Her wide eyes darted to me, a silent plea that echoed the dread curling in my chest. I struggled to keep my composure, to steady the tremor in my voice. I guess. I stammered, my words barely audible. My dad tilted his head slightly, studying me with a look I couldn't quite read. "Anything you want to tell me?" he asked. His tone deceptively light. But the weight of the question hung in the air like a thundercloud ready to burst. Every instinct screamed at me to say something. To deny. To deflect. To do anything but stand there like a deer in headlights. But the truth was too close. Teetering on the edge of exposure. And no lie I could conjure would make it go away. My mind raced, grasping for words that wouldn't come. My throat felt dry, my tongue heavy. Harper's hand brushed against mine beneath the table, a soft, fleeting touch that spoke volumes. It was meant to reassure me, to ground me. But it only made the crushing guilt worse. I swallowed hard, my voice barely above a whisper as I replied. "No. Nothing." The silence that followed was unbearable. My dad didn't respond right away, he just looked at me with those piercing eyes. His gaze unflinching. In that moment, the walls felt like they were closing in, the air growing thinner. And then it hit me, he already knew. Even without words. The truth was there. Unspoken but undeniable. Hovering between us like a specter. As I stood there, the weight of his stare suffocating me, I realized there was no hiding anymore. The truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it was buried. And though I wanted to believe I could outrun it, I knew now that it would follow me wherever I went. Lingering in every shadow. Waiting to unravel everything. As the lights in that small house dimmed, I realized that not only had our relationship changed forever, but so had the values I once held dear. The guilt, the fear of being discovered, and the loss of what was sacred pushed me into a crossroads with no easy way out. Emotions can be powerful, but they are not enough to justify crossing boundaries that should remain untouched. I learned that sometimes doing the right thing isn't about following your heart, it's about setting limits to protect yourself and those around you. Don't let fleeting emotions make you lose what matters most: family, honor, and self-respect. Life often presents us with challenges filled with temptation. But what truly defines us is how we choose to face them. Always strive to make the right choices, even when it feels like the hardest thing to do. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. If you found the content interesting and helpful, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the exciting videos coming next. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep creating high-quality content. Thank you so much.